Hello, good morning. My name is Sean Creaney. I am a lecturer in psychosocial analysis of offending behaviour at Edgehill University. I am also an advisory board member for a youth charity called Peer Power. Before I explain the purpose of this workshop today, I'd just like to mention the Beyond Youth Custody report. Some of you may have had the opportunity to read it. The title of it is Now All I Care About Is My Future, Supporting the Shift, Framework for the Effective Resettlement of Young People Leaving Custody. Professor Stephen Case and myself have done a blog drawing on this report that has been published today on the Beyond Youth Custody website. The title of it is Constructive Approaches Putting Children First in the Youth Justice System. The purpose of this workshop is to discuss, define the purpose of service user participation, but also to talk about the challenges particularly promoting children's voices in a risk-focused context. With the vast majority diverted out of the formal youth justice system, this is something we've heard about particularly today, but also yesterday. The proportion of children with complex needs on yacht orders has increased. Crucially, reductions in core funding and from local partners and workload pressures, high caseloads and new assessment systems, particularly Asset Plus, can, if we are not careful, constrain practitioner expertise, discretion and innovation. Can also, crucially, constrain children's participation in the planning and execution of effective services. Now, being sentenced by a court removes some choices. A custodial sentence, for example, cannot avoid infringing on certain rights. However, children do have a right to a voice on matters that affect them. That's crucial. Children may perceive their treatment as illegitimate if they are not provided with the opportunity to inform the process. From prevention right through to resettlement, children have a voice. Evidence, for example, cited in the latest Youth Justice Board participation strategy that was published last year at the Youth Justice Convention, suggests positive gains are made in relation to behaviour, respect and confidence if children are provided with a voice, if decision making is shared. Children can also help organisations. Children can help their particular youth offending service identify areas for development and improve the service. This is crucial. Children may feel that because of their offender status, they are unable to influence the decision-making process, as they are not the ones in positions of power. Whether that, for example, is their ISS timetable, whether that is the referral order contract, whether that is a professional meeting, a high-risk meeting, whether that is their risk level. Meaningful participation, practitioners may feel that the main focus of their work should be securing formal compliance. And formal compliance is different to substantive compliance and meaningful engagement. By ensuring that children attend appointments, for example, which can result and does result in children adopting more of a passive and disengaged role in youth justice processes. Overly negative interventions that are demanding, that are tokenistic, that are imposed on children must be avoided. We must challenge this tick box culture that is evident. Some children, young people, may see their order as an inconvenience. They may want the order over and done with as soon as possible. Therefore, meaningful participation is important. Children's voices, and I'm going to come back to this point, children's voices should automatically be part of the decision-making process, from the planning stages right through to service evaluation. Participation must not be overly, and that's the key word here, overly controlled and managed by practitioners. Children's wishes and feelings can be overruled in a risk management context. Establishing trusting, empathic relationships as a medium for change. This was highlighted in the HMI probation report on desistance and young people. Instilling hope, encouraging shared decision making and pursuing joint ownership of interventions and treatments is important. Children's meaningful involvement in service design and delivery can prove beneficial not only in terms of preventing offending, but in terms of promoting positive outcomes and developing a principled and humane youth justice system. This leads nicely onto Professor Case's discussion, talk around positive youth justice.
Thanks, Sean. It's not a discussion, it's just me saying what I think. You can agree or not, and we can talk more afterwards. Why am I here? I've never been before. Thank you for inviting us. My research and my work as an academic since 2000 has been child-focused, participatory work based in one particular youth offending team, Swansea Youth Offending Team, and in the Welsh context of youth justice. I've done a lot of work with a colleague called Professor Kevin Haynes over there, and some very charismatic, forward-thinking, progressive and brave stakeholders like Eddie Isles at Swansea Yacht, Dusty Kennedy. Is Dusty here? Well, he's not in here, is he? So I'll say what I like about him. He won't watch the video. But Dusty and Rod Morgan and John Drew and points in between. So the nature of my research was, and my kind of scholarship as well, and my critique of youth justice academically, and the evidence base that I've tried to generate to inform kind of better youth justice practice, has been kind of a two-stream approach, a bifurcated approach, we'd say. I've got to try and avoid academic nonsense, because we don't need it. So if there's anything that I say that just sounds like bullshit, just let me know, and I'll translate it. I mean big words, not the arguments. They might sound like it, I don't know. We started off, me and Kevin and Eddie and Swansea, in this Welsh policy context of when the youth offending teams first came on board. I don't know how much you know about the Welsh social policy context, but it differs markedly, and it certainly did at that time, in the first 10 years of the new youth justice, from the English policy context. The social policy context for children and young people was had more emphasis on a rights and entitlements-based approach, promoting positive outcomes, a kind of a collectivism, a universalism of service. And it was very difficult to reconcile with this new form of youth justice that was coming out of Westminster, that was very heavily risk-focused, had a huge obsession with this risk factor prevention paradigm of identifying these psychological and immediate social risk factors, and targeting them through intervention on the basis that this was evidence-based in inverted commas and effective in inverted commas. And I would keep those inverted commas, and they've got bigger over the years, because that's the bill of goods that you've been sold, that this is an effective evidence base. And it is an evidence base, but it's partial. And we started to develop a critique of what was wrong with this risk-focused evidence base and all of these unfortunate offshoots of this RNR and risk factor prevention paradigm model, asset scaled approach kind of model, in terms of interventionism and in terms of treating young people as if they were adults, and in terms of responsibilizing, giving too much responsibility and capacity to what were essentially children breaking the law, and how this was directing practitioner understandings of children who offend in a particular direction through the systems that you were given, things like asset, and then ultimately the scaled approach and the key elements of effective practice. And we developed this critique over a number of years and wrote about it. And for potted history, there's a book, but I haven't bought any flyers, damn, it's called Understanding Youth Offending, that we put out in 2009, which coincided quite nicely with the scaled approach coming on board. So we sent this book to John Drew, and he read it, and within 6 months we were all around a table talking about, if we didn't have the scaled approach, what would something else look like? The problems with, from an academic evidential point of view, the problems with a risk factor focused approach to understanding young people who break the law and responding to them, purely evidentially, methodologically, is this evidence base is partial. And what I mean by partial is it's biased and it's incomplete. It's biased towards explaining youth offending, for want of a better term, in a particularly individualized way, which promotes almost blaming a young person. It traditionally has promoted explanations that almost blame and responsibilize young people for breaking the law and take our eye off understanding their lives in a more complex, multifaceted way. For example, social and structural factors, the interactions that they have with the youth justice system, which we know can be criminogenic in and of themselves. It promotes and has promoted an interventionism that's disproportionate to the extent and nature of youth offending as measured in YJB statistics, you know, and has taken our eye off diversionary approaches, promoting positive outcomes, even promoting outcomes that have been based around desistance, strengths-based, good life model, capacity building, human potential, those kinds of approaches, because the partiality, the bias of this kind of explanation, this kind of way of looking at young people, this lens for framing their behaviour, is almost entirely negative in its origins. It focuses on the risks that they present to themselves and other people. I've got to take issue with the title of this workshop. It was negotiated, and I just do not like it at all. Managing the risks that young people present. It's, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have that title, but I thought I'd just mention it while we're being filmed. It perpetuates something that's very negative, right? If you're not sure what I'm getting at here, you can ask me afterwards, but the risk factor model, the risk factor lens, understanding young people, extremely negative. It characterizes young people, when they break the law, as a collection of risks, deficits and flaws that need to be corrected through adult intervention. That's the framework that it perpetuates. I'm not saying that that's what you've done or that's what you do, and I know we've moved away from it slightly, but that is down to practitioner discretion, expertise, understanding, relationship building, all the positive features of a positive youth justice. But the risk factor prevention paradigm in and of itself is negative facing. It's retrospective. What's wrong with you? How can we cure it? It's deficit based. It's what we call in academia positivist, pseudoscience, pseudo-psychology taken from America and taken from some big players in the UK like David Farrington, Communities That Care and all that. The evidence base itself has perpetuated a system where you only tend to focus on the negatives, so you certainly prioritise the negatives. Let's prevent negative outcomes. Let's prevent offending, prevent reoffending, prevent substance use, teenage pregnancy, prevent exposure to risk. And yes, okay. But where's the focus on strengths? Where's the focus on desistance? Where's the focus on positive outcomes? There's no focus on positive outcomes in, even in Charlie Taylor's recent review, which emphasised and concluded that we should have a child-focused system. A child-focused system is a child-focused system, not an offender-focused system or prevention-focused system. Another problem, bias, partiality that this risk obsession has led to is taking our eye off the fact that these are children that we're dealing with. Yeah? With that attendant capacity, status, ability, though the rights that come with being a child, having that status under the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. We've taken our eye off that and we've perpetuated offender-first methods of understanding these young people, which necessitate offender-first ways of responding. That's been the history. That's certainly the history up to around 2010. That's unfortunate. That's a product of it's a product of a number of things. It's a product of the prescription and the managerialism which the YJB was kind of created to foster, pushing you in certain directions, yeah, under this Crime and Disorder Act and the new Youth Justice. It's also a product of a huge misreading of an evidence base and an over-exaggeration, excessive faith in a very, very limited evidence base, a very, very partial evidence base that only looks at certain things in certain ways, that makes claims to understand the relationship between risk factorised and later offending that it really cannot substantiate with any kind of evidence. And there's the irony of an evidence-based youth justice system, that the major piece of evidence that it's supposedly based on lacks a coherent and robust evidence base itself. Yeah? Because when it came on board, I could talk for hours about it, I'm not going to, because we'll get to some positive stuff in a minute. It's getting into a bit of a rant, but you know what I mean. As I'm here, it was a third way of dealing with youth justice. It wasn't welfare, it wasn't justice, it was something else. Its time had come. It promoted efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. It was common sense, made sense to you, made sense to me, made sense to policy makers and politicians. So it was very, very politically attractive when it came on board. I'm here to say that the risk factor prevention paradigm is not effective because there's no cogent evidence base that it actually is, nor is risk-focused intervention. Actually, from the studies that have underpinned the key elements of effective practice, the APIS booklet and the scaled approach, there's no cogent, consistent evidence base, and therefore not economical, not efficient. So we've worked to a model, you've worked to a model, that's not valid in terms of accurate, comprehensive, not reliable in terms of consistent, and actually, I'd argue, unethical. Because of this negative perception of young people as young offenders, because that's what the 1990s did, it created young offenders. So we got to a stage where, Brantover, we got to a stage where we critiqued the living hell out of this risk factor paradigm, and the Youth Justice Board under John Drew had started to listen to some of these concerns, and thereby Asset Plus came on board, and the changes in Asset Plus were motivated in large part by the criticisms of the risk factor paradigm, of the scaled approach, and tried to address some of these shortfalls, one of which was an absence of the child's voice in the assessment and intervention process and in decision making. Yeah, so that was a major plank of Asset Plus. The absence of the practitioner voice in these processes as well is a major plank of Asset Plus because it was not supported by the scaled approach. The lack of quantification of risk factors is important there. There's a focus on strengths and foundations for change. No emphasis on positive outcomes and positive behaviours necessarily or explicitly, and a very, very disappointing fallback into risk in your explanations and conclusions. It's likelihood means risk. Likelihood means probability. And that's a little bit disappointing, but we need to see what the outcomes of Asset Plus are before we get into that. But Swansea and other yachts across Wales had started to develop an approach that was kind of counter-intuitive to the scaled approach, that embodied more rights-based, Welsh social policy-based ideas around treating children as children first and offenders second, which is an idea that was kind of invented in the late 90s by Kevin Haynes and Mark Drakeford. They'd seen, and we continue to see, elements of very, very positive child-friendly practice and the framing of the child in very positive terms and progressive and constructive terms across Wales and also across England as well, and increasingly so across England now. And so we obviously responded to the common criticism which was from policymakers and practitioners, which was, you know, you think this approach is so terrible, what would you suggest? Yeah? And so we sort of cohered a series of principles that we'd seen in practice across the country into a model, a principled and kind of progressive model, a set of sort of foundations or touchstones for positive youth justice practice, which are evidenced as well in another book called Positive Youth Justice. I haven't got time to go into the evidence, but it has got an evidence base, and it's an evidence base, very strong evidence base, that is that was developed in partnership with practitioners and through participatory work with children and young people. And so, just go through very quickly what I think these principles are and how I think they progress the worst, the most negative excesses of the new youth justice. And of course I caricature the new youth justice in practice in really in the 2000s because because I have a genuine problem academically with the risk paradigm and what you were given, but also in order to sort of provoke a debate, yeah, to nudge this kind of debate forward, to talk about some of the areas that we should be talking about. And participation is but one, and the Child's Voice is but one way of working with children in a more positive and progressive way to move away from what we did in the past. Everything that we do as practitioners, as policymakers, as academics and researchers should be child-friendly. And we know that. I think probably nobody's going to disagree with some of these things that I say about what the principles of our practice are. I'm sure they're embedded at a personal level or even an organisational level within your practice now. But they're not prioritised in inspection frameworks or key elements of effective practice, or not measured as KPIs necessarily. And so they'll continue to be good practice that's unrecognised, that's under the radar. They do have an evidence base that's starting to creep into the YGB Resource Hub that never showed up in the key elements of effective practice documents. But they do have an evidence base that isn't about risk. Everything that we do should be child-friendly, we know that. And as I've tried to explain, the risk factor focus is inherently child-unfriendly. Yeah? It deals with these children in very negative ways. It frames a child as though they have got much more capacity and responsibility for their behaviour and for extricating themselves from that behaviour through intervention, and capacity for engagement with intervention as well. And almost takes the focus off the fact that they are children, they are vulnerable, or at least we used to think they are. They have multiple problems and issues that adults, practitioners and other key stakeholders should be facilitating them with, should be helping them, one of which is accessing their universal rights under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. These aren't little adults, these are children, these are kids, these are young people. Yeah? We don't want our youth justice system to become a miniaturised version of the criminal justice system. And so it's about the methods that we use and the decision-making processes that we perpetuate that frames that debate. More positivity, more promotional approaches. Where is the pursuit, even the quantification, the measurement, the prioritisation of positive, pro-social outcomes? Asset Plus gives you the space to actually do that. The diversionary out-of-court framework actually gives you the space that the increase in local devolution agenda is giving the space to be able to promote these promotional approaches. Cost an lecture for 15 years of talking like this, you know what I mean? Positive, and move away from this obsession with negativity, yeah? This obsession with risk, bundles of risk, and protecting that. Yes, we've got to protect the public. Yes, we've got to respond to victims. But we've got to deal with the person in front of us who's a child and not a risk, a set of risks. They're a kid, right? They're a kid. And let's try to, I've got a huge amount of evidence that adopting a promotional approach, I don't mean protect, maximising protective factors, although that is important too, can actually have these preventative outcomes as well, can be successful, can be effective, but it's effectiveness in a different way, yeah? You can judge the effectiveness of the system, the effectiveness of your practice, and can be expected on different areas. We decide to look at it in different ways. Diversion, obviously you've got these frameworks in place now. I know, the powers that be recognise this. This is important. For ethical, principled reasons as well, not just pragmatic, austerity-driven reasons. But there's an effectiveness and efficiency, an evidence base, and an ethical basis to being diversionary and being positive and being child-friendly. These are all linked together, these principles. Yeah? Diversionary as we possibly can be. And this is where participation comes in. To realise this kind of child-friendly, a legitimate, a credible child-friendly approach to delivering youth justice, or to working with children and young people with complex needs, etc. At all stages of the system, we need to embed some participation, some meaningful, as Sean was talking about, and as Tom will talk about, meaningful participation processes, not this kind of consultation processes. I'm not going to get into meaningful participation processes with practitioners because that's another hobby horse that was probably for another presentation. But it's got to be meaningful, and that means participation in decision-making processes too. There's a framework, called a principle of PYJ called systems management, which is there are particular decision-making points in a child's trajectory into and out of the system, at which we can steer them in different directions. And if we make these decisions in child-friendly ways, we can divert, we can be positive, we can be effective and efficient, and all those things that you need to be. So it's got to be credible, meaningful participation. We really need to take this seriously as a hot topic, really, in youth justice, and not just give it lip service, because it fits in a broader, more ethical and progressive framework of working with kids, working with children, and not be adult-centric, which we have been in the past. This is how we understand your lives. This is what we're going to do about it. You're going to sort of toe the line. And that's not suggesting that that's what your view is. That's suggesting that's the structures and processes in place that you've been given to work with, pushed you towards working with young people in that way. And taking on after the fact that they are children and they've got a universal right to participate. It's a central plank of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. Yeah? Participation, provision, and protection. And Sean mentioned legitimacy, and this is an academic concept, but legitimacy means if a child sees that understands their treatment by agents of the state, for that's what you are, by adults, to be fair and be humane and be equitable and be justified, they're far more likely to participate in and engage with interventions. And engagement is another principle that's very important, because that's a step beyond participation. That's a psychological commitment, belief in what's happening to them, how you're working with them. It's a sustainable approach. It's far more effective than just participation. Yeah? So if we work in child-friendly ways, we promote this idea of legitimacy. It's how the young person experiences what's happening to them. Yeah? It's more likely to be legitimate if they're involved, participate in meaningful ways, rather than, the old criticisms, doing youth justice to children and young people, and them experiencing that as such and feeling disengaged and disempowered, not understanding the processes and the language that's being spoken around them and the court process. And there's huge amounts of evidence that this works, and there's huge amounts of evidence that this doesn't. and this is damaging and harmful, and this, worst excess of the new youth justice, this is why we're starting to move in another direction. This is why sentencing guidelines are moving towards child-friendly youth justice. This is why Charlie Taylor talks about child-focused youth justice. This is why the National Policing Strategy is children first and offenders second. For a whole host of reasons, evidenced reasons that we're trying to promote, we're trying to support, we're trying to help, and we're not trying to harm. I'm all ranted out now. That'll do for a little bit. Well, there's an elephant in the room, of course, which is operational reality. And I don't deal with reality, so I'm going to leave it to Tom. Talk about that. Now go, clap.
Yeah, it struck me actually listening to that. Sorry, Tom Dukes, I'm a manager with the Youth Justice Services across Cheshire. It's a shared service for 4 local authorities. I will talk about operational reality because there's a few things to come back on that. And it struck me just listening actually, I've got to say this as a preface. 2 academics and a grey-haired YOS manager. We're not exactly the greatest, the most diverse, authentic panel, are we? We're talking about participation, so it's a point to make about how difficult it can be actually. There's a reason for that. I'm a last-minute call-up, thanks Sean, for 3 days' notice to be here speaking. It was supposed to be Liam, those of you that were here at the conference last year may remember Liam Hill, who co-chaired the conference last year, big 6'4" guy in his early 20s. And he was due to be speaking today to talk about some of the stuff that we've done locally across Cheshire, which is participative, hopefully meaningful, and has had some good outcomes. Fortunately, he had an operation in hospital yesterday, so we can't be here today. So I'll do my best in a not quite as an authentic way to represent some of the stuff that he will be saying. And I think I'll start with making that point, actually, that all of the stuff that Sean and Steve have said, and I think you said, a lot of us would agree with those principles. What you don't hear said as often is how bloody hard it is. You know, the operational reality of working in youth justice as a practitioner and as a yacht manager is doing some of that stuff. Active engagement, active involvement and kind of active participation is tricky stuff. And I say that as somebody who's worked as a practitioner in yachts since they started back in 2000, in several yachts and as a manager. And the workforce we have in yachts are probably the most skilled at this kind of stuff, and it's still difficult. So that's, you know, thank you for the invite on the operational reality, because that's what it is. But more of that, so we have to be creative, and I will share some of the stuff that we've done with Liam around that. The other thing, just to pick up on, I don't want to provoke an argument, but this is about debate, isn't it? about the kind of some of this Steve's saying about. I don't necessarily agree that being child-friendly, positive, diversionary, participatory, and legitimate is mutually exclusive from being risk-focused. I think I absolutely agree with what we've had over years in the youth justice system is as an overly defensive as opposed to defensible system. We've been hamstrung by regulatory and inspection frameworks that measure processes and outputs and don't measure meaningful participation, because that's the thing. It's immeasurable, actually. I'll talk about the mentoring stuff and how you measure the quality, essentially measure the quality of a relationship. Because what we heard yesterday, what will be talked of in seminars right now is that's the bit. We know there's an evidence base that works, but actually there's a leap of faith and there's a punt that's got to be taken on setting some of that stuff up, because we're not rewarded for it in yachts. Actually, it's not part of our day-to-day activity. Whereas assessment and management of risk absolutely is. It's a fundamental aspect of what we do. When HMIP come in and look, they're looking at the assessment quality. They're looking at our management of risk. What gets measured gets done. And that's the operational reality for yachts. So I would welcome a slight freeing up of some of that kind of regulatory framework, a freeing up and a relaxation of some of the, what I would say are very overly prescriptive national standards, so that some of that stuff is more rewarded. I was encouraged actually yesterday at the, a bit more encouraged, at the HMIP workshop and the draft stuff, where there's seemingly going to be some space for yachts to kind of showcase some of the stuff they're doing, and it might be some of the creative participatory work, but also bring some of the challenges, and I'll certainly be doing that, bringing some of the challenges that we've had locally. So yeah, I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. So what we do in our region then, and what certainly Liam would have been talking about if he were here. And I don't think it's not radical stuff. It's pretty intuitively obvious, and it's trying to implement the principles that Steve and Sean espouse. I suppose my point on it, and it's happening. It's happening. I don't want to say what we're doing in Cheshire isn't necessarily different. In fact, it's evolving and growing and developing. I've borrowed stuff from doing peer reviews of things I've seen in Leeds and Oldham and elsewhere. So it's not radical stuff. I suppose what is maybe a bit different about what we've done in partnership with Voice for Children is essentially what we've tried to do is support the growth of one of our own, to grow your own principles. So supporting the growth of a user-led grassroots, in Liam's case, it was just him, to try and scale that as a social enterprise model that can stand alone, almost as a kind of alternative service delivery vehicle to what we do, and can then bring in alternative funding sources and can be commissioned. So that's what we do. And that's based on some work. I don't know if there's anybody from Trafford or Manchester in the room, but it's based on some work that did back many years ago now around young people's involvement on the periphery of gangs, and a realisation that they weren't listening to kind of white middle-class guys and women in yachts. They weren't listening to social workers, and they certainly weren't listening to the police. But they were listening to guys who'd been there, done it, walked in their shoes, and were authentic and credible to them. So, we did something, and Sean's heard me say this before, we took a risk to manage a risk. We took a punt, and we did something called the Rough Diamonds Project, where we invested in, trained up, and commissioned, in a way I had to convince commissioners. That's not an easy thing again. What are the outcomes for this, what we're trying to measure? It's kind of the relationships, really. We're not very good at it, they're going to be better. But we took a punt on that. It was quite successful. Risky, but quite successful. And we had guys who'd been there and done time and all the rest of it, and actually happened upon, God, this works. This is the best way of getting kids out of gangs, is actually to have this peer mentoring model. So going back to where Liam's involved, I met Liam first about 3 years ago when I first arrived in Cheshire, and was struck immediately by his potential, and that was what it. When I had a conversation with him, I said, God, Liam, you'd make a great mentor. And he said, oh, right, yeah, well, tell me more about that. And that was it. It was the seed of talking to Liam as an individual. And you might think, those of you working in yachts, we're quite lucky to have Liam, and yeah, he's an impressive guy. But he's been on a journey, and I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that all of us that work in yachts sit on what I would call untapped social capital, and we just need to find them. And it's the effort and the creativity to kind of find them and invest in them. Really, something that I think it was Junior said yesterday, peer power thing at the end of the day, on the big stage. And he said something about the guy who's working in a business analyst in the city now, and he talked about having drive and other young people having drive, and he mentioned something about but the road's closed, and that I guess with Liam, that's what we opened the road for him, we invested in him, and that I think is the bit that needs to be encouraged. The difficulty is, well, it's not rewarded, it's not measured, it's not captured, and it's risky actually because shit happens sometimes. And if Liam was here, he would talk to you about that. I suppose the bit about how do we get the voice of young people into managing risk, and I get where Steve's coming from on that. The practical example of how we've been able to do this in Cheshire, and we're still experimenting with it, is Liam himself and mentors that Liam is now recruiting and training who will be matched with some of our young people. He and the other mentors will be the conduit to the young people. They will represent their voice. Anybody in yachts, we probably all have variations on high risk management meetings, case planning forums and the like. And as a challenge, I'm interested to hear actually how people do this, because it's tricky. How do you get the young person's voice meaningfully and actively into that? Do you invite them in? There are some practical and philosophical challenges around that. I'm a fully paid up member. Liam will say to the kind of nothing about us without us will work for us mantra. But again, operational realities, practicalities, how do we actually do that? Having peer mentoring as a part of that solution is one way of doing it. So on a slightly more aspirational level, and we're not there yet, what we're trying to do with Voice for Children, because it's still about Liam Hill and recruiting, training up some peer mentors, where we're trying to get to is to create a kind of virtuous circle. and we're on the steps towards that, of having young people that are involved in the youth justice system and in the care system now being trained up by Liam to be peer mentors, and eventually, if we can scale it, help him grow the organisation so that he can actually be an employer as well. And that's the, so they're then putting back people who've previously been seen as part of the problem, being actively involved in being part of the solution, because they want to. A lot of these kids have got that passion to be involved. And the other, again, I think Liam would be talking about the work that we've been able to jointly do. I've got big up to the Police and Crime Commissioner actually in Cheshire, who's seen the light, and Liam and I had a conversation with him, and he's invested. A commissioner who's prepared to take a punt on something that's not immediately measurable. But we've got a project around children in the justice system who are also in care, and Liam has been able to recruit young people in the care system to actually go out. I don't know whether people know about Reg 44, Regulation 44 visits. It's where children's homes are inspected. So we're now getting young people in the justice system and the care system to be essentially part of the QA process for children's homes. And the idea is that they will be paid roles. Local authorities will pay for that to be done. So it's a whole investment thing. Again, let's see what the social capital is. Let's kind of support them to be kind of fully paid up members. None of that will feature, I don't think, in any HMIP stuff or any national standard stuff. But it's really valuable work that yachts could do. But we've got to be creative about that. And finally, before we have some discussion, because I'm keen to hear from other people about how this works locally for them. The other bit that we're doing with Voice for Children is, and again, this isn't necessarily new. People might be familiar with the Young Advisors model. Young Advisors are effectively trained consultants to advise organisations on how they might co-design, co-produce services that are going to be effective with young people. We're looking at creating a bespoke project, Young Advisors project, that they will decide what it's going to be called. I don't know what it is yet, but we're currently recruiting them, and Liam's training them up. And what I want to try and get to, conversations with commissioners now, and again, this is the challenging bit about partnership work for yachts. Youth justice stuff is such a tiny proportion of what commissioners are interested in. In our area, we have 6 CCGs, police and crime commissioners, 4 local authorities. There's a lot of commissioning power there. It's not necessarily integrated amongst themselves, and I'm going there saying, actually, there's different ways of doing this. But mental health transformation leads are interested in getting the voice of young people. We know that our explicit youth justice service users are often excluded from that. So what we're trying to do is get them to invest in our own participation champions, young advisors group, that they can then pay to actually help inform and co-design, co-produce services. And we will get there, I think, probably first of all around the substance misuse stuff. All sorts of challenges around commissioning cycles, different local authorities in different places. But there are conversations now that our youth justice service users through Liam are involved in helping to inform commissioners on what a substance misuse service should look like for young people in the justice system. Again, that's about seeing the talent we've got that's previously untapped in our service users and taking a strengths and assets-based approach rather than a risk-based approach. I'll shut up now. But I don't know, are we going to open it up to...
Yeah, open it up, Tom. Just before we do open it up, if that's okay, Tom, just to echo a couple of points there from Tom. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for presenting at such short notice with us as well. I'd just like to note a few points to complement Tom's points before we have discussion. Described as desistance in practice, peer mentoring involves those with lived experiences of system contact, providing advice and support to their peers experiencing issues that they can relate to. Peer mentors can be an authentic and credible voice. That was something Tom stressed. An inspiration to others that change is possible, and support their peers to influence decision-making processes also. They can genuinely say, and I know Liam would have commented on this as well, peer mentors can genuinely say, I know how you feel, I've been through that. They can offer advice and support and encourage children to attend appointments and engage with interventions. Thank you again, Tom. And thank you, obviously, to Steve. So, there are a number of questions that we have put onto a slide that relate to the discussion, but obviously if people want to ask us questions or make any comments in particular, then we encourage you to do that also. We have a microphone as well, so if you want to raise your hands and make a comment, or you may have some thoughts on these questions as well. Question number 1, to what extent is practice in youth justice participative, children first and strengths based? Oh, God.
As much as it can be, because most of the time your work is a difficult concept, was it? It's about expediency. That seems to be the main thing often. So I think there's an ideal, isn't there? Everyone wishes it to be that way, but it never really comes to fruition. I was just thinking before, Tom said something about a young person said they have the drive. What was the statement? We have the drive.
I think Junior's words of paraphrase is, I have the drive, and other young people have the drive, but the road's closed.
Yeah, and I think that's key, isn't it? Is that a person to do what's good or what's right or act in life has to have a reason, and we create the environment, the right environment. You can't force a reason onto somebody, and I think sometimes in our jobs we try to do so by instilling fear, almost. Don't do this, otherwise you're going to get in trouble. Well, it's counterproductive quite often, because someone will find a way of circumventing, rules or regulations. But if a person has a deep-seated reason for doing something, and then has the right environment in order to flourish, then things work better, don't they? So, obviously, this that's been discussed today is ideal. But in the current framework, is it really possible? I think, it might be, green shoots of recovery is being said about the inspectorate looking to say things are going to be monitored in a different way. But really, when some of those things are quite nebulous to get hold of, aren't they? They're difficult to measure. Then really, I guess it involves all of us to stand up and say, actually, we want to be measured in this fashion rather than just on whether this risk assessment has been done correctly, etc., etc.
Thank you. Question number 2, how do you meaningfully, so that was how the presentation started today, how do you meaningfully involve children in assessments, interventions, planning, supervision and evaluation? So maybe one of those points, maybe any of those points. How do you meaningfully involve children?
What we do in SEFTO is obviously, post-assessment stage, so when actually that meaningful intervention begins, and it needs to be meaningful, otherwise we're just revolving door with these young people. Actually what we're doing to them, as opposed to empowering them to make those informed decisions. But from a practice development perspective, we put in place a couple of years ago where the intervention worker or whomever was delivering the face-to-face practice would record in a way that captures the young person voice. So systematically you've got a routine outcome measure on every time you see a young person from a national standards perspective. So it becomes a matter of routine that the young person feeds back on what they did, whether they felt it met their needs, and also revisit the part of the plan that they're on, the priority area. So it becomes a kind of plan, do, review, but it's driven by the young person feedback. And we've also encouraged, and it went down like a lead balloon initially, because my background isn't yacht, my background is youth work. When I came in as a youth vending manager, I'd said, I need you all to be asking, what can I do better? self-assess me. What was, you know, in this session, how would you rate the content and also my engagement? And actually, it's part and parcel of the business now. And I think for me, that is about meaningful participation. Just wanted to make a comment about social education and social control. Actually, if you drive equality, education and empowerment, then people become very productive in their own communities. So if you start with the education, the rest will follow.
Excellent, thank you. Question number 3, how do you promote meaningful participation in a risk-focused context? Any comments on that question? Thank you for the example before and the work that you're doing. Any other comments?
I think the debate has been interesting in terms of setting up, I think, a false dichotomy, just as in practice, that there's nothing ever been in national standards or elsewhere that says you can't work in a way that you engage a child, that, you know, how you manage their risk is you discuss that with them. There is a conversation, you be honest, you be open, you use language that they use. And in Hackney, where I work, actually a failure to attend is a failure on the organisation to engage properly with the child and the family. Now, there's nothing ever been in national standards that says you can't work in that way, that you can't be systemic, that you can't include the family, look at the system and make explanations. If we want justice by painting by numbers, yeah, we will get it. You know, that we are allowed to be reflective, engaging with children, and actually be honest about the risks, the needs and the requirements that they have.
Thank you. Related to that, and it was a point that Tom mentioned, within your services, do you allow young people to attend high-risk meetings that you have? Do you allow the young person to attend the meeting, or are they not invited to those meetings that you have where risk is discussed?
That's the most difficult thing, is to invite them, but getting them to engage, because they're actually quite good meetings, and it's finding a way that is inclusive and small enough that you're representative, and what they are, they're quite open spaces, and we're set up with it. It's a challenge, but families got a solution to that.
Same as this gentleman, welcome on paper, but you have to walk into a meeting with 10 dozen professionals there. It would be very threatening. Talk to young people about it. Just to say the same as the gentleman that just spoke, technically on paper we invite people, but it would be a very intimidating thing to do and doesn't tend to happen in practice. We try and get written views.
Yeah, it seems that the way some youth justice services or youth offending services manage this particular issue, they mimic what happens with MAPA meetings, in that young people, or offenders rather, that's the word that's used, offenders are not allowed to attend the meeting, nor are they entitled to have advocates. What's supposed to happen, according to guidance, is that young people feed into the meeting initially, and then the decision that's made is properly explained to the young person afterwards. But it's quite an interesting area because, and it's something I would suggest the Youth Justice Board look at as part of my PhD research. Some children don't always realise that meeting has taken place, don't fully understand their risk level, and have not had the opportunity to make that decision in terms of actions that are taken. So some high-risk meetings happen, some children are not aware that they've happened, and they're not sure of the justification that has been given. It's a real challenge, it's a real area that is so challenging. Conscious of time, question 4, how important is it to strike a balance between promoting the voice of the child and what the child wants, but then what the needs of the organisation are? How do you balance that?
So I think you're asking the wrong question. I don't think it's about finding a balance between the needs of the yacht and the young person's voice. I think it's about intrinsically how you weave the young person's voice into what the needs of the yacht are and should be going forwards. So I don't have an answer to your question because I think it's the wrong question.
So are there any other comments? Thank you for your comment. Any other comments about the challenges? For example, a yacht worker has to fill out an asset assessment, but say, for example, the young person doesn't want the yacht worker to fill out that assessment. In practice, how would you manage that? I spoke to one young person as part of my PhD research, for example, that went to a CAMS meeting, and then he came back to the yacht worker, and he had to answer lots of questions to the yacht worker about how the CAMS meeting went, and he said, I really didn't want to answer those questions because I feel, from his point of view, the yacht worker's role is to prevent offending, not to be asking me about how my CAMS meeting went. So how do you balance the day-to-day assessments, completing reports, with what young people want and what their perspectives on things?
Meaningful participation in the first place. So that's about meaningful participation. Because actually, if with that example, I would absolutely agree. Why would the child want to disclose what had happened in a meeting to a yacht officer? But actually, if the yacht officer was talking in a meaningful way, explaining why they needed that information, or even prior to that really, enabling them to go to that meeting and participate in that meeting with support from the yacht worker. And to me, it just would make more sense. So I'm bubbling a bit, yeah. Sorry.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's all about how you kind of lay the pitch for the child, really, because just sending them off to a meeting and then getting them to feedback, that's not meaningful at all, is it? That's definitely doing too. So where is the child in that really?
Thank you. Question 5 relates to the work that Tom is doing. What are the benefits and some of the challenges with involving children with shared backgrounds and experiences, helping and supporting their peers? What are some of the challenges? I mean, there might be, some yachts might have participation groups, for example. One worker said to me as part of my PhD research that hopefully I'll have finished next year, that we don't have young people on the referral order panel asking other young people the reasons why they've offended, exploring the risks, etc. Sorry, yeah.
That's all right. I was just going to say, in terms of the benefits, I think we all probably understand the benefits of getting young people involved. In the challenges, we've been finding it's just being part of a massive bureaucratic organisation. So we were looking at trying to get a peer mentoring scheme set up as part of a group that we run. And when we just wanted to get young people to come in and do sort of, work with young people that is potentially supervised by us, we were told we had to kind of go through the normal volunteer process that was absolutely massive and didn't fit what was needed. So we did come up with a bit of an alternative, but it isn't proper peer mentoring, if you know what I mean. We can get young people in and kind of do talks, but we can't do the sort of schemes that's maybe been set up. So I'd be really interested to see how that's been navigated by that project as part of like a really massive organisation in terms of like local authority and all the kind of rules around recruiting volunteers. We were told we had to go through the same as if we were recruiting adult volunteers. So the DBS checks and the kind of like having a certain amount of time before you can recruit them if they've offended. We were kind of coming across those barriers.
And then also a particular challenge might be that they're on a statutory order, so maybe participation in the peer mentoring project, does that count as an appointment, or is that additional?
Yeah.
Some young people I spoke to didn't want to be doing additional things. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you to every person that commented. Many thanks. Any other comments at all, or any questions that you'd like to ask me, Tom or Steve?
What it would look like for you not to be concerned anymore, or for their parents not to be concerned, or their carers not to be concerned. So
so they know what they're aiming for. And I think those conversations don't always happen with young people. I think it's really important that young people understand their assessment of risk effectively, but obviously in more child-friendly terms than that, and how they can move from that assessment to a different assessment.
Thank you for that comment. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Could I just say one thing? It's not really a question, but
Yeah.
I do the job down in Exeter, and in Exeter our magistrates have really got the sense of custody as a last resort.
Yeah.
And if you're a young person in Exeter, you're going to go to prison, if you're going to go there at all, after a number of YROs, probably you'll have to have breached a YRO with further offending as well, and quite a lot of it. Hardly anybody in custody in the area where I live, 3 young people currently. The other side of that is you get to work with some people that are offending a lot in the community and not being sent to prison. And I'd like to relate that back to assessment that you've heard about. You know, if you're doing your 5th contracting, making an assessment with somebody in the community, you need something different. And in court you're asking us for another YRO, the last one didn't work, what are you going to do that's different? And I think this might be an element of what's different. I think, picking up on something that Tom said, I think if you can work with the young person on what they want to do, I don't think that's different to what Steve was suggesting about risk. If you can work with the one thing that somebody wants to do and you've got their attention on that, then I think you're beginning to turn the key about what unlocks the benefits of the youth offending system. But actually, yeah, we get a lot of orders and we have to rethink what we're going to do differently. Not a question, I know, but that's the situation we're in.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh,
I just wanted to make a really quick point about signs of safety, because signs of safety, if you use it properly, you can engage the young person and the family around the discussions about risk, because it's trying to simplify the language, but also young people that have been through experiences, supporting them with that words and pictures exercise, helping them understand what's happened. But you're sitting side by side, you're not adversarial, you're not doing it to them, you're bringing them along with you, and them understanding about how they keep themselves safe, and them understanding that and kind of being involved in that conversation. It's just about getting them on board and making them see and having a voice and talking to them and getting their opinions and using them in the signs of safety model. So we haven't completely rolled that out properly in YOS where I work, but we're planning to. And I think it's a great tool to use in terms of children and their families being involved, because it comes from, you know, from a child protection system where it's a very difficult subject matter. So I think it's got a lot to go.
Thank you. Thank you for attending our workshop. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for participating in the discussion and debate as well. Thank you.